When the family started singing, the entire 300-person studio fell into absolute silence. Steve Harvey, in that moment, understood something profound. This wasn't just a game anymore. The cameras kept rolling. The producers in the control room leaned forward in their chairs. And what happened next would become the most unforgettable moment in Family Feud history, not because of a funny answer or a shocking comeback, but because of something far more powerful. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday taping. The Thompson family had traveled from Ohio to face off against the Martinez family from Texas. Standard setup. Standard questions. Standard game show energy. But tucked in grandmother Eleanor's purse was a folded piece of paper, a song written by her late son David, who had passed away 6 months earlier from cancer. She hadn't told anyone she was bringing it. She hadn't planned what would happen. She just knew she needed it with her. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage that afternoon like he had thousands of times before. Signature suit sharp, smile ready, energy high. He shook hands with both families, made his usual jokes, got the crowd laughing. The game began normally. The Thompsons won the first round. The Martinez family rallied back in the second. Everything was going exactly as scripted, until it wasn't. During the commercial break before the final round, Eleanor Thompson quietly asked a production assistant if she could speak to Steve for just one moment. The assistant hesitated, glanced at the clock, but something in Eleanor's eyes made her nod. She whispered into her headset. Steve, who was reviewing cards with a producer, looked up, saw Eleanor standing there with that folded paper trembling in her hands, and without a word, walked directly over to her. But what Steve didn't know was that in the next 4 minutes, he would make a decision that would shatter every protocol, defy every producer's expectation, and reveal the kind of man he truly is when the cameras aren't the priority. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper as she explained. Her son David had written a song for the family 6 weeks before he died. It was called Still Here. He'd recorded it on his phone, weak voice breaking between verses, telling them that even when he was gone, he'd still be with them in every moment of joy, every moment of love. The family had never performed it publicly. They'd never even sung it together out loud. It hurt too much. But standing here, on this stage, with all this light and all this life, Eleanor felt her son nudging her. She didn't ask Steve for anything specific. She just needed him to know. Steve Harvey stood there, 6'2" of tailored suit and television charisma, and in that moment, he became something else entirely. He became a father who'd buried friends. A man who understood that grief doesn't follow a production schedule. He looked at Eleanor, then at her family standing by the podium. Her daughter Jennifer with red-rimmed eyes, her son-in-law Marcus trying to hold it together, her teenage grandson Cameron staring at the floor, and her granddaughter Maya clutching a photo of her father. Steve turned to the producer standing nearby and said 4 words that would change everything. "We're doing this now." The producer's face went pale. "Steve, we're live to tape in 90 seconds, we can't." "We're doing this now," Steve repeated, and his tone made it clear this wasn't a discussion. The floor director scrambled. The audience, just returning from break, sensed something had shifted. The energy in the room changed from game show excitement to something heavier, more sacred. Steve walked to center stage, and instead of his usual booming voice, he spoke quietly, almost intimately, like he was talking to family in a living room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and the audience immediately quieted. "We're about to do something we've never done in the history of this show. The Thompson family has something they need to share. It's not part of the game. It's not part of the script. But it's part of life, and life doesn't wait for commercial breaks." He gestured to the family. Eleanor stepped forward first, her family falling in around her like a constellation. Steve handed her his microphone, but she shook her head gently. "We don't need it," she said softly. "David wouldn't have wanted it loud. He'd want it close." And then, in the middle of a television studio built for laughter and competition, with bright lights and cameras and hundreds of strangers watching, the Thompson family began to sing. The studio didn't just go quiet. It went sacred. Eleanor started, her voice thin but steady. When the morning light breaks through, I'll be the warmth that finds you. Her daughter Jennifer joined in, harmony weaving underneath. When the night feels dark and cold, I'm the hand you hold. Marcus came in on the third line, his deep voice anchoring. When you laugh, when you cry, when you wonder why. And then Cameron and Maya, the grandchildren who'd lost their father, their voices young and breaking. I'm still here, still near, in every breath, in every tear. There were no instruments. No production. Just 5 voices carrying a song written by a dying man who wanted his family to know that love doesn't end when the heart stops beating. Steve Harvey, standing off to the side, brought his hand to his mouth. His eyes filled. And for the first time in 40 years of television, Steve Harvey had absolutely nothing to say. Because there was nothing to say. There was only this. This raw, unfiltered, holy moment of a family choosing to honor their pain in public, to sing through their grief, to let a studio full of strangers witness their love. The song lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, the silence held for 5 more. No one moved. No one applauded. The moment was too fragile for applause. It needed to breathe. Then Steve did something no one expected. He walked over to the Martinez family, the opposing team, the people who were supposed to be rivals in this game. And he gestured them forward. Come here, he said quietly. And they did. All 5 members of the Martinez family walked across the stage and embraced the Thompsons. Strangers holding strangers. Competitors becoming comforters. The audience rose. Not in applause but in witness. Standing because sitting felt wrong. Standing because this was bigger than entertainment. This was humanity at its most vulnerable and most beautiful. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve Harvey stood in the center of it all, and slowly, he removed his suit jacket, the one that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, the one tailored perfectly, the one that was part of his armor, his brand, his image. He walked over to Cameron, the teenage grandson who'd been staring at the floor for most of the taping, and he draped that jacket over the boy's shoulders. Your father, Steve said, his voice thick, is still clothing you. He's still covering you. You understand me? Cameron nodded, unable to speak, and Steve pulled him into a hug that wasn't for the cameras. It was the kind of hug a father gives a son. The kind that says, I see you. I see your pain. You're not alone. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve Harvey turned to the production crew and made an announcement that would cost the network thousands of dollars and throw the entire taping schedule into chaos. We're not finishing this game. The producer's voice crackled in his earpiece, but Steve pulled the device out and set it on the podium. We're not finishing this game, he repeated to the studio. Because some things are more important than winning. Some things are more important than points on a board. The Thompson family came here to play, and they played with more courage than I've ever seen. They won something bigger than $10,000. They won their father back, if only for 90 seconds. And that's enough. That's the whole show right there. He turned to both families. Here's what we're going to do. Both families are going home with the top prize. Both families are going to be taken care of. Because today, there are no losers. Today, we're all just people trying to remember that love is the only score that matters. The studio erupted, not in game show applause, but in something that sounded like relief. Like everyone in that room had been holding their breath and finally could exhale. People were crying openly. Camera operators were wiping their eyes. Even the stoic floor director was shaking his head in disbelief, moved beyond his professional detachment. Eleanor Thompson walked over to Steve and took his hands. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Steve said simply. Your son wrote that song to remind you he's still here. I'm just making sure the world knows he was here. That's all I did. She pressed the folded paper, the original lyrics in David's handwriting, into Steve's palm. Keep this. she said. So you remember that today, you weren't just a host. You were a witness. You were a healer. Steve looked down at the paper, ink smudged from being held so many times, and he folded it carefully, slipping it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. I'll keep it there, he promised. Always. Behind the scenes, the network executives were furious. The taping schedule was destroyed. The episode couldn't air as planned. Legal was involved. Standards and practices had questions. But Steve Harvey didn't care. And when the episode finally did air, re-edit, repackage with a special introduction explaining what had happened, it became the highest-rated Family Feud episode in a decade. Not because of the game. Because of the moment. Letters poured in from across the country. From people who'd lost parents, children, siblings. From people who'd been holding grief so tightly they forgot they could share it. From people who saw in Steve's decision a reminder that compassion doesn't have to follow a script. One letter, from a widow in Montana, read, I lost my husband 2 years ago and I haven't been able to listen to music since. But when I heard that family sing, I remembered that he's still here too. Thank you for showing us that grief and love can exist in the same breath. Steve framed that letter and hung it in his office, right next to the folded lyrics of Still Here. Months later, Cameron Thompson, the grandson who'd received Steve's jacket, wrote Steve a message on social media. He was wearing the jacket in his senior photo. He'd had it altered to fit him, but he refused to wash it, because he said it still smelled like hope. He told Steve that the song his father wrote had become the family anthem. That they sang it at birthdays, at holidays, at moments when they needed to feel him close. That because Steve stopped the show, they started living again. Steve replied with 3 words. Your dad knew. The jacket stayed with Cameron. The song stayed with the family. And the moment stayed with everyone who witnessed it, whether they were in the studio that day or watching from home or hearing about it years later. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because here's the truth that Steve Harvey understood on that stage, in that moment, when he threw away the script and followed his heart. Television shows end. Games finish. Prizes get spent. But the decision to honor someone's humanity, to stop and say this matters more than the machinery, to choose compassion over convenience, that reverberates forever. Steve Harvey didn't save the Thompson family that day. They saved themselves by choosing to sing through their sorrow. But Steve gave them the space to do it. He protected that space. He made it sacred. And in doing so, he reminded an entire studio, an entire audience, an entire country, that the best thing we can ever do for each other is simply this. Bear witness. Show up. Stop the show when someone needs us to stop the show. David Thompson never met Steve Harvey. He never stood on that stage. He never saw the lights or heard the applause. But his song did. His love did. His family did. And because of one man's willingness to break the rules, David's presence filled that studio so completely that everyone who was there swears they could feel him, standing just off stage, smiling, singing along. The jacket is still with Cameron. The song is still sung. The moment is still remembered. And Steve Harvey still carries those folded lyrics over his heart, a reminder that the most important thing he's ever done on television had nothing to do with entertainment, and everything to do with being human. The jacket stayed. The song remained. And Steve Harvey learned what he'd always known but never quite lived until that moment. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do is simply stop and let love speak. That's the real show. That's the one that never ends.